Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us today for episode 657 of People Behind the Science. This week, we are rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Suzana Herculano-Houzel, which was originally released on August 1st of 2016. Listeners, Suzana is a biologist turned neuroscientist who is conducting fascinating research comparing the brains of different organisms to understand the number and types of cells they have. To understand the number and types of cells they have, the impacts of brain size, and what gives rise to our unique cognitive abilities as humans. She shares more about her life and her science in our conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science. So sit back, relax, and get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Suzana Herculano-Houzel. So, Suzana, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm well, thank you.
Great. We are excited to have you with us on the program today, and I am excited to introduce you to our listeners. So, listeners, Suzana is a professor of psychology and biological sciences at Vanderbilt University. She received her bachelor's in biology from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and she completed her master's in neuroscience at Case Western Reserve University. Suzana was awarded her PhD in neuroscience from the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris, as well as some of the research she did for her PhD was done at the Max-Planck Institute for Brain Research. Suzana served on the faculty of the University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, before joining the faculty at Vanderbilt, where she is today. Now, Suzana has received many awards and honors during her career. For example, she is the recipient of the Scholar Award in Understanding Human Cognition from the James S. McDonnell Foundation, as well as the José Reis Prize of Science Communication. In addition, Suzana has authored 7 books now for the general public on neuroscience, including her recently published book, The Human Advantage, A New Understanding of How Our Brain Became Remarkable. Now, she has also written and presented the TV series Neurológica, and she has contributed over 260 columns to the Folha de São Paulo newspaper, as well as the Scientific American Brazil magazine. Now, today, Suzana, we want to get to know you both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by giving our listeners an idea of how you spend your time when you're not very busy doing science?
I like playing music a lot. Actually, my mother would much rather I had entered a career as a musician than as a scientist. Yeah. I had many, many years of formal training in classical music, starting when I was really young. I didn't pursue that. I really wanted to be a scientist, but I did decide a couple of years ago that I really wanted to learn how to play the classical guitar. Until then, I had self-taught myself to play a guitar, just accompaniment for Brazilian songs or pop songs. But just 4 years ago, I decided it was time to take proper classes in classical guitar. And I love it. I play almost every day.
That is awesome. So now, did you play any other instruments when you were younger?
Oh, yeah. So I had many years of training on the piano, on the flute. And actually, when I was in Cleveland, I decided that besides getting my diploma, I wanted to learn a new instrument. So I took up the cello.
That's cool. That's a hard instrument to just take up, too.
I like the sound so much. And it does have a very personal feel that the instrument is so close to you. You're really hugging it, which is something similar with the guitar as well. So when I moved to Germany to finish my PhD, I took the cello with me, and it was actually cheaper to buy a seat for the cello on the plane with me than to buy a proper hard case for it.
Really?
Yes.
That is phenomenal.
So you can imagine the look on the airline people when I tried to board the plane with the cello, and they were like, "Ma'am, that has to be checked." And I'm like, "No, it doesn't.
No, it has its own ticket.
It has its own seat." Yes. For a very long time, I kept the boarding ticket that said Mr. Cello /Herculano.
That is hilarious. I love that story. Well, wonderful to hear about this musical side of you, and great to hear that you're able to balance that with your scientific side and you're able to make time for everything that you love to do in the world. But I want to talk about your scientific side next. So can you give us a high-level view of how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with your work in your field?
I could give the very short version and say that I make brain soup for a living, which would actually be correct. What I do with that is I'm in the business of comparing brains to find out what they're made of and what difference does that make. So more specifically, I'm interested in finding out how many neurons, how many other cells make up brains of different sizes, of different species, of different types of animals, including human brains, to learn does size matter? Are all brains made the same way, which turns out they're not. Does a larger brain always have more neurons than a smaller brain? And the answer there, again, is nope. For instance, we found that the human brain, even though it's smaller than an elephant brain, it does have 3 times as many neurons in the cerebral cortex as an elephant has in its cerebral cortex. So we've proposed that that sheer absolute number of neurons in the cerebral cortex, which is highest in our species, is the simplest explanation for our remarkable cognitive abilities.
Certainly. Well, this is a fascinating research, Suzana, and I'm excited to chat more about it as we go through our interview. But I want to talk a little bit about motivation. We've talked about some of the balancing that you have to do to maintain this musical side of your life with the science. And I think scientists are often inherently motivated people, but it doesn't hurt to have some of these motivational quotes or phrases to keep you going on those tough days. So do you have a favorite one that you can share with us today?
I'm really not big on motivational phrases, but I think I'll borrow one from my dad. This is his favorite ever. It's just never give up. He has this drawing of a crane trying to eat a frog, and the frog is just holding down the crane. The frog is inside the crane's mouth already, but it's holding the crane by its throat.
Wow.
And just kicking its legs, and it just says, never give up. And he loves it. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's one aspect of being motivated. The first is, of course, getting to do something that inspires you. But the second really is having the force to hold on to it, especially when you get whacked this way and that by different things that turn up. And you do need that motivation to just persist when you do science.
Definitely. I think a lot of people describe some of the characteristics that scientists need to have as determination, persistence. So I love that. And I love that you've got this lovely visual to go with it of this frog not willing to give up. So now, Suzana, can you tell us a little bit about some of the people who might have encouraged you along your scientific career, or maybe some of these role models who you've looked up to?
Story Landis. She was my first graduate advisor at Case Western, and there were so many great things about her. I think she just recently retired from the NIH, where she ended up, I think she was many things there, but she was director of intramural research, I think, amongst others. Story actually started out as an English major and then became a scientist. She was a wonderful scientist, of course, but on top of that, she was a terrific communicator. I remember watching her talks and being amazed at how there were never any pauses. She never stumbled. She always knew exactly what the next word was going to be coming out of her mouth. And she gave me the best piece of advice ever as well. I remember the time I wrote an abstract for a scientific meeting, and we were going back and forth. I wrote the first draft. I gave it over to her. She commented on it, gave it back. And after going back and forth like 3 or 4 times, I looked at that, and I just asked her, I should just stop showing this to you at some point, shouldn't I? Because you're always going to have one more comment. She said, yes, of course. But then she told me, look, this is important, though. This is the most important thing I could ever tell you. A scientist who cannot communicate is not a scientist, because it's not just about generating the knowledge. It's actually all about giving that knowledge to everybody else so that they can actually use it. But science is really about generating knowledge. But if nobody gets access to that knowledge, then you might as well not have created it at all. So she was really big on science communication, and I think I got it from her, this just deep belief that you really have to know how to communicate what you do.
Well, I know you are quite passionate about scientific communication, and you have made great strides in some of the work that you've done, communicating not only your research, but just communicating enthusiasm and excitement for science to the public. So can you tell us a little bit about some of your efforts in that vein?
Yeah, sure. I actually started writing about neuroscience for the general public when I finished my PhD and I moved back to Brazil, which was originally to work at a science museum, so really dealing directly with the public. And I remember being upset then that there was this very ingrained notion in even friends of mine, but the public in general, I mean, that, well, a scientist is really not working. They're doing what they want. They're just having fun all the time. So a scientist shouldn't be making much money anyway. I mean, scientists should stop complaining about how low their salaries are. And this is a really big issue in Brazil. Salaries for scientists in Brazil are really are particularly low.
Gotcha.
But there was this notion, which I think has gone a bit away now. It's better, but it's still there, that scientists are special because, unlike everybody else, they can do whatever they damn please. So it's not really work. And it's so wrong. Mm-hmm. I would just think of my friends, and you were not forced to be an engineer. You were not forced to be a manager. Don't you also do what you want? Don't you also work in what you like? How is science any different? And it became clear to me that the problem was that the general public really didn't have a good idea of what being a scientist was like. What do people do when they work as a scientist? What is science about? Is science really this super complex thing that you need 10 years of studying to...
Millions of dollars, yeah.
Exactly. So I decided that I wanted to work at that. I wanted to communicate science to the general public, not just the findings, not just to get major advances through to the public, but also to give the public an idea of how science is done. That I remember one of the early pieces that I wrote was on research that showed that the fly, Drosophila, it sleeps. It actually sleeps. It doesn't just rest. And there's this really funny aspect that the research at the time involved having somebody stay up for 12 hours straight, tapping on the glass container where the flies were kept to keep them from falling asleep.
Oh, my goodness.
If you know how things work, you know that this is going to be the job of a graduate student, right?
Of course. Maybe an undergrad even.
Right. So there's this really mundane side to how science is done that anybody can relate to. And there's the down-to-earth little things that don't usually get told in these stories. So I took upon myself to make sure that whenever I wrote about how science was done, I would also try to include the human aspect of the people doing the work, or how people usually imagine it's really high-tech stuff. But often it isn't. It's just tapping on the side of a glass vial.
Right. Stuff duct taped together.
Yeah, or turning brains into soup. I mean, really, it is soup. Instead of using a super fancy $200,000 machine that can cut carpaccio thin slices of brains if you want. So I started writing for the general public with that goal in mind, to not only bring information to the public, which I think is what every science writing is about, but really to try to convey what the everyday life is like for a scientist.
Well, I love that your writing has really emphasized this human aspect of science. And that's something that's a big goal of our program as well, to show people who scientists are, what they do, what they like. And I think that is really, really important to communicate. So Thank you for all your hard work in that area. And
oh, my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
It is. It is so much fun.
It is. And actually, it's really rewarding. One of the most rewarding things for me about writing about neuroscience for the general public is the comments that I get back. It's emails from people saying, oh, my God, I feel so intelligent. I actually understood it. I never thought I was going to be able to understand it. Please keep writing because I can read this.
Right. It's digestible. Yeah. Well, Suzana, I think you do great work. I'm curious to hear what sparked your interest in science to begin with. Is there a moment or a memory that you can point to that really got you moving on this path?
I don't think so. As far as I can think back, I was always very critical, very skeptical and logical thinking, and I was always interested in figuring out how stuff worked, how come things were the way they were. And my parents always encouraged this inquisitive, curious little child who won't stop asking questions. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that I remember that for a while, I thought it would be really fun to go into a career in special effects for the movies.
Really?
Well, yeah, there's this fun aspect of solving problems, which is something that I really like. I'm a huge sucker for puzzles and any problem that needs solving. Without thinking about it, I'm actually thinking about it already. But I think when I first started having biology classes, it became clear to me that what fascinated me the most was just life. How can you put these molecules together and all of a sudden you have something else entirely just from the particular way in which things are organized. So I've actually had a completely different interest in my career. I started out working with plants, moved on to viruses. When I was at Case, I worked in development. Story Landis, my advisor, was an expert in the development of the nervous system. And that was actually my first introduction to neuroscience. I had never had any proper training in neuroscience in Brazil, where I did my undergrad. So I moved to Germany thinking, well, now I know what I really want to be when I grow up. I want to be a systems neurophysiologist. I want to study higher systems in the brain and understand how they're put together, how they work. And guess what? I ended up 4 years later writing for the general public. And from one of the issues I was writing about, that myth that you only use 10% of the brain, you must have heard that one. Mm-hmm. I actually became interested in figuring out what brains were made of because it turned out that there were a bunch of myths about that as well. From the myth that we have 100 billion neurons in our brain, the human brain, to one that usually comes right along with that, which is that for every neuron in the brain, you have 10 glial cells that help neurons work.
Sure.
So I ended up becoming a comparative neuroanatomist without ever having had any proper training in it.
You're like the Mythbuster of neuroscience. I like it.
Well, I think it actually turned out to be in my advantage because I think a number of these myths get passed on from teachers to students and from textbooks to readers. When somebody with the proper authority writes down that the human brain has 100 billion neurons and 10 times as many glial cells, then, oh, yeah, sure, you read that.
Who am I to question? Yeah.
Sure, that's a fact, right? It's like genes are made of DNA. Okay, sure, next phrase. Mm-hmm. And since I was entirely new to the field and I was really interested in it, I started digging through all the old literature, looking for the original references. Whoever said that we have 100 billion neurons in the brain and 10 times as many glial cells,
sure,
and that the size of the body matters, and that is the proportion that matters. And it turned out that it was really like a game of telephone. Everybody believed in these things that got repeated, but for no proper reason.
There was no data.
No, there was no data.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So now these are some fascinating questions that you were answering throughout your career. Can you tell us what is something you have ongoing right now that you are just so excited to be a part of?
I'm really interested in looking now at the vasculature of the brain, so the microvasculature, the distribution of the capillaries that bring oxygen and nutrients to the neurons, and comparing that across species. And the reason why I'm so interested in doing that is that one of the things that we've learned is that brains cost a lot of energy. Well, people knew that already, but something that we could show is that for the few species available so far, the amount of energy that the brain costs is simply proportional to the number of neurons that that brain has. It doesn't matter the size of those neurons. It doesn't matter the size of the brain. It only matters how many neurons that brain has. So it turns out that, for instance, the human brain costs a lot of energy, including in proportion to the size of the body. So 1/4 of all the food that you eat actually feeds your brain, even though it's a tiny portion of your body.
That is incredible, yeah.
Yeah, so it turns out that that's actually not because we're special, because our brain is extraordinarily expensive. No, it's just just that it has a lot of neurons. So it costs proportionately what you could expect for any generic brain that had that many neurons. But anyway, so that is really important because that means that your brain could actually put a huge toll on survival through the amount of energy that it costs and how long it can take the animal to eat enough to feed not just the body, but that brain in particular. So I'm really interested in being able to figure out how much the brain of other species costs, including those animals that are never going to make it to the lab alive, like a lion, a giraffe, an elephant, a dolphin. Mm-hmm. So one possibility to figure out how much energy those brains cost is to look at the density of capillaries that they have in the brain, because it's well established already that because energy gets to neurons through the capillaries, there's no other way around it. The blood has to get there. The amount of energy that a brain costs actually shapes the amount of capillaries that that brain has. So the more energy you need, the more capillaries are built in the brain. It just self-organizes that way. So that means that in principle, even though we can't bring an elephant into the lab to put it inside a scanner and measure directly how much energy its brain costs, we can very possibly look at a fixed brain of an elephant, and that is something that we do have, and study the density of capillaries in the brain and answer the question, how much energy does that brain use? Is it really proportional to the number of neurons? How much is that compared to the amount of energy that feeds the body of that animal, for instance? How does that impact their survival? How could that possibly have shaped their evolution?
Certainly. So do you have questions that are guiding you on what animals you're starting with in terms of figuring out these questions?
Yeah, it's been one of the most fun aspects of my work in recent years. It's just getting to work with brains that I can honestly say most people will never have seen. I mean, not just most people, most scientists will never have seen a lion brain or a giraffe brain or a honey badger brain. That's the one I'm after right now.
Oh, gotcha. Why the honey badger of all things?
So the honey badger is a carnivoran that, like the raccoon, it seems to be able to do some pretty awesome things that typically animals of that body size and brain size don't do. I remember watching this really cool program, I think on Discovery or one of these animal channels, on how caretaker in South Africa tried to build like not a cage really, but just a contained area for a honey badger. And this animal would always escape no matter what. It just always came up with a way to escape. We've been studying raccoons, and they're also carnivorans, so you would expect their brains not to have a whole lot of neurons for their size compared to primates. And it turns out that the raccoon, and that's also a creature well known for its, let's say, prowess.
Inventiveness, maybe.
And yes, and it's very, very proficient at breaking out of or breaking into places that you want them out of.
Sure.
It turns out that raccoons have an extraordinarily high number of neurons in that cortex that you really wouldn't expect for their size. I mean, if I showed you their brains and told you the number of neurons that they have, you would say it's a primate, and it's not. Mm-hmm. So I asked my collaborator on raccoon brains, Kelly Lambert, here in Virginia, so you study behavior. If the raccoon does all these really incredible things and it really has the really amazing cortex, how come you people keep studying rats? Rats are boring. How come you don't study raccoons in the lab? And she just laughed and she said, yeah, we would love to, but we would need top security facilities to hold them in because the damn creatures just break out of any containment, which just goes to show how really smart they are.
Sure. Well, even if you wanted to study these raccoons and honey badgers, it sounds like not an option. So, very cool to hear more about your work, Suzana. I think you're answering some really interesting questions that I love the idea that you're taking some of these myths, some of these things that people have been saying for years and years and years and starting to dispel them, starting to gather data to empirically explore them. So I think that's fantastic. But I think so far we've talked about a lot of the exciting elements of your career, and we haven't yet talked about any of the downsides, any of the challenges, some of the struggles that you face. And I think these are important to disclose as well to give people a realistic view of the life of a scientist.
Oh, yeah.
So can you share with us one of your own challenges and how you got through it?
Well, I think one of the main challenges that I've faced were related to working in Brazil, and I don't think they're as big in the U.S. as they were there, but I think some of them do still apply, and a lot has to do with funding, not just the funding to do science, but actually in the form of salaries for people, because the way science still operates to this day is very much in a system that was inherited from the 1800s when scientists actually were aristocrats. They were very rich people who didn't really have to work for a living, so they did science for fun.
Sure.
And I think some of the problems that we have in modern society still come from that time. So like we were talking before, this problem that some people think that, scientists shouldn't really be highly paid people because
they see it as a hobby.
They're having too much fun.
Right.
And so one of the major problems that we had in Brazil, and my colleagues there still have it, is that salaries are, especially when you're just starting, when you're just out of college, salaries are pathetically low. A full month of salary, which is not called a salary, it's a stipend for a young scientist who just graduated college and is going through the necessary master's and then a PhD. The starting salary will be for the first 2 years during master's will be $400 per month.
Oh my gosh, that is not enough to live on.
No, it's not. And after 2 years, then you move on to your PhD, and that's 4 years of making, not much more than $600 per month. And that's going to be the next 4 years of your life, and then you become a postdoc and you graduate to $1,000 per month. So that's most likely going to be 10 years of your life until you can actually have what is called a proper job. And of course, the values are very different from what you have in the U.S., but given the proportions, that still is a discouragement to many people who just look at their friends who graduated college and they have proper jobs with proper salaries while you're still considered a student, not really a professional. See, so that is a big discouragement. And add that to just a lack of funding. And when I was still working in Brazil last year, things got bad to the point that I had to resort to crowdfunding to be able to fund my lab.
Oh, wow.
Which worked.
Sure.
And that was a reflection of the really bad moment that the economy is going through in Brazil. But yeah, that's when you realize that you really need funding to do the work. And it doesn't matter how much people like or appreciate what you're doing if you're not properly funded. If society doesn't really value science and its scientists, then guess what? Pretty soon we're going to run out of people interested in doing it.
Right.
Because it's hard work. We were talking about motivation. It's many hours of sometimes doing boring stuff. Just repetitively sitting at the microscope or mounting slides or drawing, tracing neurons and brains and whatnot. And a lot of people do get discouraged by that. And in a way, I like to tell my students, that's a good thing. It's also called natural selection. We do need only the top, highly motivated people who want to get an answer so much that they're willing to do what it takes, several hours of sitting at the microscope per day or whatever it takes to get the job done.
Certainly. So then did you find it as a faculty member in Brazil difficult to recruit enough talented students to work with you in your lab even?
Yeah, it was easy in the beginning. For many years, we had ample supply of interested students, not only interested, but really able to do the job.
Sure.
But as years went by, the turnover rate got really, really high. We would get undergrad students who would join the lab, but really not stay for more than 2 or 3 months. As soon as they realized what their quote-unquote salaries were going to be for the next years of their lives, the vast majority would quickly say, this is really not for me.
Sure.
I don't care about this that much. So I think that's something that any government should be really careful about, mindful of. If you like the science, you have to take really good care of the scientists and keep them happy and motivated.
Certainly. Well, I think this is a huge challenge, not only for you, but for a lot of scientists out there. It sounds like maybe in countries outside of the U.S. in particular. I think we complain about our graduate student salaries, but, thinking back to my stipend, it was very manageable. And I think trying to make a system that encourages and fosters young scientists across all countries, I think would be phenomenal.
Yeah, but the good thing is that I see that changing a lot in the U.S. already. When I was a graduate student, I had a stipend. It was certainly much more than what my peers were making in Brazil. I could afford to live by myself in Cleveland, which is something that in Brazil, young graduate students just cannot. You have to live with your family.
Sure.
So I do know that a lot has changed in the U.S. and in many countries in Europe. Once you graduate college and you're hired to train as a young scientist, you are properly hired. You have a salary, you have rights and benefits like anybody else doing their job in any other field, which is exactly how it should be. So that's really good news.
Definitely. Well, it's been great to chat about some of these challenges, but I also want to talk about the success stories, the high moments. So, Suzana, do you have a success story that you can share with us, whether it's a big win or even just a small victory that meant a lot to you?
I can tell you that moment where you really jump in joy, I've had it.
Oh, yes. Do tell.
That was when I got the award from the James McDonnell Foundation in 2010. It started out with an email that sounded very much like those scam emails saying, you're going to win a prize. Just reply here and enter your information, and we're going to give you this incredible amount of money. And I was in Brazil. I had never heard about them. So I read this email inviting me to apply for an award. But I go online, and sure enough, it's real.
Seems pretty legit.
Yeah, completely. So it required writing a 2-page grant proposal. 2 pages.
That's really hard.
When usually grant proposals run at least 20, where you can go into the details of what you want to do. So luckily for me, I had been writing about science for the general public for several years already. So you tell me I have to sit down and write 2 pages to convince someone to give me money to do something. That won't put me into a panic. Right. I sat down and wrote those 2 pages, sent in my proposal, but not really believing that nothing's going to come out of this. And who am I? I'm just a young scientist in Brazil. There's plenty of people with better conditions to work than I do. It's going to go to somebody else, but it's been fun. It was nice to be considered. So I was minding my own business in my little lab, and in comes this email saying, congratulations, you won a $600,000 award, which in Brazil is unheard of. Nobody gets that much money to do research as an individual. I remember really just jumping in joy and screaming in the lab, I got it. It was unbelievable. And it really was life-changing money. I mean, the work that I can do now on vasculature and comparing all these different brains, it requires some pretty fancy microscopy that I would never have been able to do otherwise.
Certainly. And now with the brain soup techniques that you developed, did that come out of this money as well?
No, that actually came out of having absolutely zero money to work with.
Really?
Yes. Because, the traditional way to count cells would have been using microscopy and all this fancy equipment and fancy software that today I am able to afford using that grant money. But back when I started 12 years ago, I had zero money. I had no lab. All I had was a question. I wanted to know how many neurons different brains were made of, regardless of their size. And I thought I knew how to do that. having read a bunch of papers on people doing different things, there was this idea in the 70s that a good way to determine how many neurons different brains were made of would be to extract all the DNA in a brain, and then you divide that number, that amount of DNA, by the amount of DNA that you find on average in individual cells in that animal, which is mathematically okay.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah, but I remember reading that and just going, no, don't count DNA, just count nuclei, because every cell has one and one only cell nucleus. So if you're going to destroy the tissue to extract the DNA, just stop one step above before you destroy the nuclei and keep the nuclei. And that's something that I knew from undergrad lab research that was feasible. So I walked up to a colleague in the department who was very well established. He had his own lab. And I asked him, look, I have this question, and I think I know how to solve it. And I think it's going to be really important because people think they know what brains are made of, but they actually don't. And don't you think that if you're interested in these really fancy questions in neuroscience, we should first start with the basics of what different brains are made of?
Right.
I have no lab, though. Would you be interested in partnering up with me? And he did. And that's how we got to brain soup, because I had no microscope, I had no proper training in stereology, which would have been the traditional way, let's say, to do it. So out came brain soup, and it works beautifully, and it's super cheap. It's really inexpensive.
Well, that is phenomenal, and I think it's got a catchy name, too. It gets people interested right off the bat. Brain soup. Well, Suzana, wonderful to hear about this story of success, not only of the McDonnell Foundation grant funding, but also this amazing success that you were able to achieve in methodology with very little funding. I think that is equally impressive. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. And I know we've talked a little bit about some of the things you like to do outside of science. And I know in the world of science, scientists spend a lot of time reading the literature, keeping up to date on it. But I love to chat about what books scientists are reading for fun. So is there a book recommendation that you can give me and our listeners today of something you've really enjoyed, whether it's a science book or not?
Oh, yeah. This is a book I've been talking about a lot for completely different reasons. I really like reading fantastic literature. I work with science, so I read about facts all day long.
Sure.
So I really love to have my mind blown away by just completely impossible things, just for the heck of it. But there's this book that I really love called, in English, it's Death with Interruptions. It's by this Portuguese author. He's a Nobel Prize winner, José. And it tells the story of what happens when death, upset by being so hated and despised by people who never wanted, who want to avoid it and evade it at all costs, death decides to just take a break, go on a vacation. I'm not going to kill anybody anymore. And it's awesome because it's a, fictional, of course, account of what people never really stop to consider, which is how life would be different, even in the lowliest practical aspects, if nobody died anymore. It's just beautiful. It has these really surprising moments. You see that the author really gave it a lot of thought to what the consequences would be, and then people come up with these really cool alternatives, cool get-arounds, because once they realize that nobody dies anymore and the hospitals are getting crowded with people who just lie there.
Right.
They're not going anywhere. They don't come back, but they also don't die. And somebody realizes that if they cart their family members over the border, then they die. And it becomes a problem, an international problem, because this country starts dumping people on their neighbors so that they can finally die there.
Oh, no.
Not in their own country anymore. And it might sound cruel.
Maybe a little morbid, yeah.
Yeah, but it's written so beautifully, and it really makes you think of all these aspects of life that you just usually don't. And besides, there's the actual character of Death. She's a woman, and she makes these appearances throughout the book. And the book is one of the most beautiful pieces of literature with these plot twists and turns that I had ever read.
This sounds excellent.
I highly recommend it.
Well, I will definitely put it out there for our listeners. Like I said, I love chatting about books, but I also love chatting with scientists about travel. Every scientist I've talked to has at least one amazing travel story to share. So, Suzana, I know you've had lots of travel opportunities. Can you share with us one of your own stories? One of these places you've been to that really sticks out in your mind that you've traveled to for science?
That really is one of the best upsides of being a scientist, all the places you go to and all the new people you meet. Mm-hmm. I have been to dozens of different places, really dozens of different places. I actually have fun putting pins on a map to mark the places.
All the places you've been. I love it.
Yeah, it's really fun. But I can definitely tell you the best experience I've had. It was Sydney, Australia. It was an amazing stay, maybe also because it was long enough. I was there working as a visiting scientist at Neuroscience Research Australia with George Paxanos and Charles Watson for 2 months. And it was an amazing experience in so many ways. These are two amazing gentlemen who happen to be scientists. They're fun, they're outstanding in what they do, but they were also amazing hosts. The country is beautiful. People get out of work every day around 5 p.m. and they don't go home. They go just hang out in one of the many beautiful parks that they have in the city. The city is not crowded. You can get anywhere you want. You can ride your bike. It's gorgeous. Everybody looks happy and healthy. And I was treated like a world-class scientist, which is something I was really not used to. And we could do great work like we wanted to. I learned a lot. It was really an amazing experience.
This sounds like a wonderful trip. So have you been able to return to Sydney since you've been there that first time?
Yeah, I returned, I think, 2 years later, and I spent another 3 weeks there, I think. And it was great again, shorter. Mm-hmm. I really look forward to going back there and meeting more people, interacting with more scientists. Australia does also have this wonderful thing running for my interests, of course, all the animal diversity that they have that nobody else does. Although the government is very protective of its fauna now, and very rightly so. It used to be really easy to study platypus, for instance. Now, not anymore, exactly because it was too easy for too long. So the animals have become endangered, which is really too bad.
Sure.
But it's a fascinating country in so many aspects.
Well, it sounds like you had a wonderful experience both of the times you were able to go to Sydney. And I think these travel opportunities, you're absolutely right, are one of the best parts about the job of a scientist. But I think you pointed out the people, too, the people you get to meet when you're traveling, as well as your colleagues that you work with every day, are phenomenal.
Right. Something that I've always insisted in telling my students back in Brazil, well, everywhere is far away, right? Mm-hmm. But I always encourage them to go at least once a year to, for us, is our Mecca, the neuroscience meeting in the U.S. every year in the fall. Not just so that they could get a refreshment, update themselves on the science, but especially so that they could actually meet the people whose papers they were reading, put a face to the name that you read all the time, and realize that these are just people. These are normal people that you can sit down at a bar and have a beer with, that you can joke with, that you can talk to about other things, not just science. It's really easy. We're talking about the general public, but there's, even amongst scientists, young scientists, I think it's far too easy to have this distance from the established scientists whose papers you read and think that, oh my God, these are untainable people. I can't ever.
You feel starstruck, yeah.
Yeah, I can't ever approach him. Oh God, really? Walk up to her?
What would I say?
Why would I ever do that? And I would take my students to these meetings and just push them on. Go talk to her. There's such and such whose papers I know you like. Go talk to them. Go introduce yourself. And it's really important, and it's really life-changing. They would come to me and tell me, I never knew that Dr. Such and Such was such a fun person. It's really cool. Like, yeah, he's a normal person. So just
Right. Well, and I think it kind of emphasizing that scientists have lives outside of science, that they have senses of humor, different personalities. I think these are huge. And I think one way to sort of demonstrate this is talk about some of the traditions that scientists have had, or just some of the funny and fond memories that you shared together. So do you have maybe a story that shows your own human side?
I don't know. Scientists do have lab traditions. I know that in Germany, when you graduate there, your lab mates will put together a special top hat built from scratch with things that had something to do with your work, and you had to wear that hat that day, of course, and look ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I decided I wanted to start a tradition in my own lab, and since we always work with different unusual animals, I found that there's a German company that makes these little animal figurines. They're about 5 inches tall, usually made of sturdy plastic. Gotcha. And you can pretty much find whatever animal you want. So I decided I wanted to give each student that graduated from my lab one of these figurines that everybody else in the lab would sign for them, just as a souvenir of their time in the lab.
Oh, that's cool.
They like it, but I hadn't realized how much they really appreciate that first I visited a former student of mine who was in Reading, and I was walking around through his new lab, and I get to his desk, and guess what? There's a giraffe with everybody's signatures sitting on his desk. That was the giraffe that I gave him.
It's like a trophy.
And he graduated. Yeah. And I was just back in Rio for a student who graduated working with carnivore brains, and I messed up. The lion that I had bought for her got moved with my lab stuff, and I didn't have it with me. I thought it was just sitting there in my drawer, but it turned out it wasn't. And she was so disappointed, and that's when I realized, what have I done? This has really become a thing now.
Yeah. So were you able to get a replacement lion in time?
Yes. I promised her that the next time I go to Rio, I will bring her lion. She absolutely will have her lion. She should have had it the day she graduated anyway. It was my bad.
Well, I love this tradition. I must say, I've never heard of a similar tradition with little animal figurines. I think that's awesome.
Well, most people work with mice and rats, and it would be really hard to write on their little bodies.
Right, fit everything on there.
Yeah, so it helps when it's a bigger animal.
Definitely. Well, I think this is a fantastic tradition, a little memento to give all of your students, a little remembrance of all the people in the lab who've signed it. So wonderful tradition. And I know we've talked about some of the people that you've worked with over the course of your career, and you mentioned this piece of advice on communication and the importance of scientists being able to communicate coming from Story Landis. Is there any other really important piece of advice that you would like to pass on to our listeners today?
I've learned something a couple of years ago that really changed the way I make decisions now and the way I think about options. It's this new definition of what intelligence is. And this is a subject that's professionally important to me because one of the reasons why I'm interested in figuring out what different brains are made of is because, I suspect that the number of neurons that you have in your brain should be the most limiting factor to how capable that brain should be of processing information, right? So in a word, the number of neurons that a species has should be limiting towards its intelligence. Let's say how intelligent a species can be. But the problem is, how do you define intelligence? How do you compare intelligence across animals? And I came across this definition by a physicist who works at MIT. His name is Alex Vismer-Gross. And his definition of intelligence is the ability of making decisions that maximize the number of future possibilities.
I like it.
It's awesome. So in other words, you're intelligent when you make decisions that leave the most doors open for your future. And I caught myself thinking in those terms when I next had to decide amongst alternatives. And not only it makes a lot of sense, I think it actually helps a lot. So now when I give people advice or when I'm trying to decide something for myself, I always think in those terms now. What choice could I make now that leaves me the largest number of possibilities available next? What can I do now that keeps the most doors open in the future? And I think that works. I think it could be helpful for a number of people, just like it was for me.
Certainly. I think that is a great mindset to pass on to our listeners. And we talked about in this question the difficulty of defining intelligence, but I think we've also discussed some of the big questions you've answered in your research. And I think big questions are fun to talk about. So I want to know today, Suzana, if we gave you everything, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, no barriers to your research, what is the big question that you are still dying to answer?
Well, first, I would put an elephant in a PET scanner.
Of course.
Of course. And a lion and a giraffe and a dolphin, just to be able to measure directly how much energy its brain and the rest of the body costs. And to go along with that, I would have this amazing off-the-charts microscopy system capable of mapping out synapses in the brain and counting them, because that's the alternative factor that determines how much energy a brain costs, not its number of neurons, but its number of synapses. And if 10 years ago we couldn't tell how many neurons go into different brains, to this day, we still really don't know how many synapses the different brains have, and is that really important at all? Is that a factor at all? Nobody has a clue. So I would love to go there.
Well, those are fantastic big questions for us to think about. And I hope that one day we get to be able to answer. We'll get that elephant in the PET scanner. Well, Suzana, thank you so much for sharing your insights and stories today. Is there any last piece of motivation or insight or any last piece of advice that you want to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah. So first, science is fun. Science is a lot of fun. I guess they are right when they say that scientists do get to have the most fun in their jobs. I certainly love my job. I do have fun every day. I do look forward to the next day at the lab. But one final suggestion, this is what I tell my students. Read everything you can. Read books from people who say things that you agree with, but most of all, read your enemies. Read people who say things that you absolutely disagree with, but you know what? If they have the facts, maybe the next truth, maybe the next great idea is going to come out of there, and you never know, but you just have to get the facts. So the more you read, the more informed you are, maybe the better chances you have of having the next great idea. And it's a lot of fun.
Well, fantastic advice, Suzana. Listeners, if you're looking for more to read, like I said, we are going to put those books that Suzana mentioned on our book list, and you can find it on our website. Now, Suzana, if our listeners want to learn more about you and all the amazing work that you've been doing, where can they go?
They can look up my lab website. The address is www.SuzanaHerculano-Houzel.com/lab. They can also just Google my name and lab, and Google knows very well how to find me.
Google can find you, yeah.
Yes, Google knows my lab home address. Google also knows my email. People are very welcome to email me at my personal address, which is Suzana, Suzana, then hh@gmail.com. I like to tell people I read every single email that I receive. Whether or not I can reply, that's a whole other issue.
Gotcha. Well, listeners, definitely feel free to learn more about Suzana's research and reach out if you have questions. And Suzana, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. It was really fun talking to you.
Well, it has been so much fun for us to chat with you. And listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.